Welcome to Infidelity Files. I never imagined that my life with David and his son, Michael, would take such an unexpected turn. Our marriage was blissful, and Michael was a wonderful young man. We shared easy laughter and comfortable silences, a bond that felt both familiar and new. But as time passed, a subtle shift occurred, a spark, a tension, a something that couldn't be ignored. It was a look, a lingering touch, a shared moment that felt charged. One morning, as I was getting ready for the day, I heard a knock on the bathroom door. It was Michael, his voice low and hesitant. He needed something from the bathroom. As he stepped inside, the air crackled with unspoken possibilities. His eyes lingered on me, a silent conversation passing between us. In that moment, I felt a surge of awareness, a recognition of the unspoken tension between us. It was a dangerous game, a dance on the edge of propriety. We were treading on thin ice, each cautious step bringing us closer to the precipice. Yet, the allure was undeniable, the forbidden fruit tempting and sweet. He paused, holding up a bottle of aspirin. You, getting ready for something?" he asked, his voice laced with a strange intensity. I glanced at him, startled. "No, just starting my day," I replied, trying to play it off. "You look different," he said, his gaze lingering on me. A surge of heat rushed through me. "Different? How?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his eyes flickering with a newfound intensity. "I don't know. It's hard to explain," he mumbled. The tension between us was palpable. This wasn't the Michael I knew, the kind and respectful stepson. This was something different, something dangerous. He took a step closer, his hand brushing against my arm. A shiver ran down my spine, an electric charge coursing through me. I was caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Desire, fear, and a sense of forbidden excitement warred within me. "I'm sorry if this is weird," he confessed, his voice barely audible. "But I've been feeling something lately, and I don't know if it's just me." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. I was speechless, my mind racing. This was wrong, so very wrong. But the pull between us was undeniable. It was a dangerous game, a fire we were playing with. "I know this is wrong," he whispered, his hand still on my arm, "but I can't help how I feel." I pulled away, my heart pounding. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. I needed to escape, to process what had just happened. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his expression a mix of longing and regret. I stumbled out of the bathroom, my heart pounding in my chest. What had just happened? How had things escalated so quickly? I was lost, adrift in a sea of confusion and guilt. The rest of the day was a blur. I tried to distract myself with household chores, but my mind kept wandering back to the encounter with Michael. His touch, his gaze, the unspoken tension between us. It was all too much to process. As the day wore on, the weight of the situation grew heavier. I replayed the scene in my mind, every detail etched in my memory. The closeness, the intensity, the unspoken promise. It was a dangerous game, a fire we were playing with. When Michael finally returned home, the tension between us was palpable. We exchanged a silent, charged glance, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. "Hey," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The silence stretched between us, a heavy, suffocating weight. I didn't know what to say, how to act. The line between friendship and something more had been blurred, and I was terrified of the consequences. "Hey," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. I stood up, feeling a surge of self-consciousness. The tension between us was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken. Michael looked nervous, his gaze flickering between the floor and my face. "I just needed some air," he mumbled. I could see it in his eyes, the same turmoil I was feeling. This was a dangerous game, a fire we were playing with. But the pull between us was undeniable, a force that was consuming us both. "I'm sorry if I made things weird," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what came over me. I shook my head, trying to regain my composure. "It's okay," I lied. "I wasn't expecting any of this. I just feel like there's something between us," he confessed, his voice filled with longing. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." I couldn't deny it. The connection between us was undeniable, a force that was pulling us closer, despite the moral implications. "We can't do this, Michael," I said, my voice trembling. "You're David's son, and I'm—" He interrupted me, his hand reaching out to touch mine. "I know all that," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "But that doesn't change how I feel." In that moment, all pretense of restraint vanished. We kissed, a desperate, passionate kiss that spoke volumes. The world faded away, leaving only the two of us, lost in the intensity of the moment. We were treading on dangerous ground, a forbidden love that could destroy everything. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. The future, the consequences, the moral implications, all of it faded into the background. We were caught in a whirlwind of passion, a dangerous dance that could consume us both. And as we kissed, I knew there was no turning back. We pulled apart, breathless and dazed. The weight of what we had just done hung heavy in the air, but instead of regret, I felt a strange sense of relief. The tension, the unspoken desire, had finally been released. "What do we do now?" Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't go back to the way things were. The line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. "This isn't over," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "We'll figure it out." He smiled, a tender look in his eyes. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. We would face whatever came next, together. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken promises. Every touch, every shared moment was electric, charged with a secret that bound us together. The quiet evenings on the porch became our sanctuary, a place where we could escape the world and indulge in our forbidden love. One evening, as we sat on the porch, the sun casting a golden glow over the yard, Michael broke the silence. "Have you thought about what this means for us?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Of course," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. We were treading on dangerous ground, a secret love affair that could destroy everything. But for now, we were content to live in the moment, to savor the intensity of our connection. The air crackled with tension as we pulled apart. Our foreheads rested against each other, our breaths mingling. A wave of relief washed over me, a sense of release from the unspoken. We'd crossed a line, a dangerous one, but there was no turning back. "What do we do now?" Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. The future was uncertain, the path ahead shrouded in fog. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over. "We'll figure it out," I replied, the words spilling out before I could fully consider them. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and hushed conversations. Every touch, every smile was charged with a secret, a dangerous secret. We were walking a tightrope, balancing desire and guilt, passion and fear. One evening, as we sat on the porch, the setting sun casting a golden glow, Michael broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I nodded, my heart pounding. Of course. The question hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken. We were both aware of the line we'd crossed, the forbidden nature of our connection. Yet, we were drawn to each other, a magnetic force pulling us closer. I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I knew what he meant, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. I'd thought about it constantly, the implications, the consequences, but I couldn't deny the feelings that had taken root. Michael's eyes met mine, a raw vulnerability in his gaze. I don't want you to think this is some kind of phase, he said. I care about you more than I probably should, and I know this is complicated, but I can't stop how I feel. My heart ached with the truth of his words. I cared about him too, deeply, but the reality of the situation was daunting. The potential consequences, the betrayal, the pain, it was all too much to bear. I care about you too, I replied, my voice trembling. But it's not just about us. There's David. He's your father and my husband. Michael's expression hardened. I know, he said, his voice filled with regret. I don't want to hurt him either, but I can't pretend like nothing's happening between us. The weight of the situation was heavy, the future uncertain. I didn't know what was right, what was wrong. But one thing was clear. We couldn't ignore the connection between us. I don't know what the right thing is, I whispered, my voice barely audible. But I know I can't ignore this anymore. Michael reached out and took my hand, his touch grounding me. We'll figure it out, he said softly. Whatever this is, we'll face it together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, we sat in silence, the weight of our unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. But in that moment, as we held hands, I felt a sense of peace. We were in this together, and that was all that mattered. I rested my head on Michael's shoulder, the rhythm of his breath a soothing lullaby. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. But the reality of our situation loomed large. David would be home soon, and I dreaded the moment I would have to face him. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen glances and unspoken words. We walked a tightrope, balancing desire and guilt, passion and fear. Every touch, every kiss was a secret we carried, a shared burden. One night, as I lay awake, the weight of our situation became too much to bear. I couldn't ignore the feelings that had grown between us, the intense connection that bound us together. I knew I had to make a decision, a difficult one, but one that couldn't be avoided. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Michael stood in the doorway, his expression serious. I've been thinking, he began, his voice barely a whisper, about what you said about David. I know this is hard, and I don't want to put you in a difficult position. My heart ached as he spoke. He understood. He felt the weight of our situation. I love you, Anne, he confessed, his voice steady. I don't know when it happened, but I do. And I know it's not fair to ask you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know. His words hit me like a tidal wave. I'd known how he felt, but hearing him say it out loud, admitting the depth of his feelings, made everything feel more real. I love you too, I whispered, the words escaping my lips before I could stop them. Michael's eyes widened in surprise, a flicker of hope igniting in his gaze. We were on the brink of something dangerous, something forbidden. But in that moment, I couldn't deny the intensity of our feelings. We were caught in a whirlwind of passion, a love that defied logic and reason. The moment stretched between us, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken. We were on the brink, a dangerous precipice, and I knew there was no turning back. As we kissed, A wave of relief washed over me, a release from the tension that had been building for so long. When we finally pulled apart, we were breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. The weight of what we had done hung heavy in the air, but it was overshadowed by a sense of exhilaration. We had crossed a line, a dangerous one, but it felt right. "What do we do now?" Michael asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. I didn't have an answer, but I knew we would find a way. We were in this together, and we would face whatever came next. The days that followed were a delicate dance, a balancing act between our secret love and the facade of a normal family. David's return added another layer of complexity, a constant reminder of the stakes involved. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the tension between Michael and me was palpable. Every glance, every touch was charged with unspoken meaning. We were walking on thin ice, each moment a potential catastrophe. When David excused himself, leaving us alone, the silence was deafening. The weight of our secret hung heavy in the air, a silent reminder of the choices we had made. We were caught in a web of desire and deception, a dangerous game that could have devastating consequences. Michael shifted nervously, his hands clenched together. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible situation we were in. "We can't keep doing this behind David's back," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's not fair to him." Michael stared at me, his expression a mix of pain and understanding. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "We need to figure this out," I replied, the weight of my words settling heavily on my shoulders. "We can't keep living in this limbo." We sat in silence, the weight of our unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. We knew we had to make a decision, a difficult one, but we were both terrified of the consequences. "I don't know what the right thing to do is," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But we can't ignore this anymore." Michael nodded, his eyes filled with sadness. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I can't pretend like this isn't happening." We sat there, holding hands, the weight of the world pressing down on us. We knew that the future was uncertain, the path ahead fraught with danger. But we were in this together, and we would face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The next morning, as David left for work, Michael and I were left alone. The silence in the house was deafening, the weight of our secret heavy on our hearts. We knew we had to talk, to confront the reality of our situation. "We need to talk," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Michael nodded, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about it too," he replied. We sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of the conversation pressing down on us. We knew that this was a turning point, a moment that would change our lives forever. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "I love David," I began, my voice trembling. "But I can't ignore what's happening between us. I care about you, Michael, a lot, and I don't know how to reconcile that with my marriage." Michael leaned forward, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and understanding. "I don't want to hurt him," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I don't want to lose you either." I felt a pang of guilt. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but the truth was undeniable. We were caught in a web of complicated emotions, a dangerous game that could have devastating consequences. "I think we need to take some time," I said, my voice barely audible. "We need to figure out what this is without rushing into anything. Maybe that means stepping back for a while." Michael's face fell. "Stepping back?" he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. I nodded, my heart heavy. "It's the only way to figure this out," I said. "We need to be sure of our feelings." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with sadness. "If that's what you think is best," he said, his voice barely a whisper. We sat in silence, the weight of our decision hanging heavy in the air. We were both hurt, confused, and uncertain, but we knew that this was the right thing to do. We had to be honest with ourselves and with each other, even if it meant sacrificing our own happiness. The days that followed were a blur of quiet moments and unspoken words. We were both navigating uncharted territory, trying to find our way through the emotional turmoil. It was a painful process, but it was necessary. As the days turned into weeks, I began to see a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this was a chance to redefine our relationship, to find a way to love each other without hurting anyone. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Our connection was undeniable, and it would continue to shape our lives, for better or for worse.